John Constantine, a Hellblazer podcast.
Hey everybody, and welcome back to John Constantine, a Hellblazer podcast. Today we are reading issue number 151, and just a little catch up on what had been going on in the last story arc. John is in America, and he was in a prison, and we weren't sure exactly why he was there, although he was in a pretty bad looking prison, hanging out with people that were like convicted murderers and stuff. So we could assume either he did something pretty bad, or he was convicted of something bad that he didn't do. And pretty much from the moment that John stepped in the prison, he didn't seem worried or fazed by it at all. In fact, he ended up taking over the prison and caused a large riot with some magic, enough so that eventually the FBI sent someone in to talk to him. And that's what happened at the very end in the last issue. So we saw this FBI agent, who I believe was named Frank, go in and talk to John. And it turned out that John was in here for the murder of a man that he knew named Lucky. But as John told the agent about Lucky, it was clear that John didn't actually kill him. It was Lucky who killed himself in front of John because he owed money to someone named S.W. Manor, and that is actually why the FBI is here. They don't really care about what's going on with the prison, but they do want to capture S.W. Manor. And it turns out the FBI has been keeping tabs on John for a very long time, and they have a large file on him, so they know exactly what he's capable of. So the agent tells John, either you work with us and help us get S.W. Manor and we let you out of here, or you can stay king of this place and deal with the consequences. The consequences being that he would have killed John right there. Now, John, being someone who doesn't like people messing with his acquaintances or friends, decides to help the FBI because he wants to get revenge for him and Lucky on S.W. Manor. And at the very end, we saw the agent giving John directions to something or someone, and that is where issue 151 picks up. So first things first with issue 151, we got the cover. We see in the background what looks like a map, specifically of like the roads in America somewhere. We can see some city names like Somerville and Clarksburg. And superimposed on top of that is another picture, and this one is of John on the side of the highway, and he is lighting a cigarette, and we just see some smoke coming up from the shadows where his hands are covering the lighter from the wind. And we can also see on the cover that this is written by Brian Azzarello with art by Marcelo Frusin. And as we turn to the first page, we see what looks like a pretty abandoned highway, except for one sign for a food diner that is open 24 hours. Then we cut to the inside and we see John drinking coffee and smoking cigarettes as usual. And as he sits alone, his narration says, "I miss London. Now, before you drop a load in your trousers over a plaintive yearning for that dirty old town, let me warn you on the dangers of confusing sentimentality with matters that are purely sensory. To wit, if the bloody Yanks could sort out a proper cup, it'd be a fucking miracle of biblical proportions. And the cigarettes, don't get me started. Why I have to taste preservatives in something that speaks directly to me own very notion of self-preservation is a mystery even I can't fathom. Still, complaining at this juncture does little good, considering where I'm headed. I'd say I'm gonna taste a lot worse before I taste better." And over that last bit of narration, we see John get up and leave the diner and walk outside to the road's edge and sticks his thumb out in the universal hitchhiking way when you want to ride. And this shot of him hitchhiking is actually a really cool full-page splash of John at nighttime standing in front of the moon as he sticks his thumb out. So he's in silhouette and the moon is gigantic. Like there would be tsunamis everywhere if the moon was actually this big. And we also see on this page, the name of this issue is Good Intentions, Part 1. And as we turn the page, we see a car pull over to pick John up, and we don't know how long John has been standing there, but as the man pulls up next to John, he leans his head out the passenger window and says, "Where you headed?" And John answers, "Doglick." And the driver gets a sour look on his face and he asks, "What you call me?" And then John hands him a piece of paper and says, "No, Doglick, West Virginia. Here." And then the driver looks at the paper and says, I can get you close. Hop in. So John gets in the car and says, cheers. And as the man drives off, he says, hey, I'm Craig. But John doesn't introduce himself. He just says, hello, Craig. And then leans back and doesn't say anything else. And the driver looks kind of either worried or maybe annoyed by that. But then John does actually ask him a question saying, you a salesman? And Craig answers, uh-huh, aluminum siding. And John replies, you must be starving. And Craig says, far from it. Pig farmers love the stuff. Easy to clean. So what? Your car broke down? And John answers, mine? No, I don't drive. And this seems odd to Craig, and he seems a little bit more worried now, and he says, really? You don't look like I don't normally pick up hitchhikers. You know what they say. And John replies, I've heard, and I usually take a cab. And Craig says, not around here you don't. Where are you coming from anyway? And John answers with a smirk on his face, prison. And at the mention of that, Craig gets even more worried, and he moves his hands to 10 and 2 on the steering wheel, and he opens his eyes a little wider. Then he slowly looks at John, and he begins to ask a question saying, what? But John cuts him off, knowing what he's going to ask, and says, murder, shooting a bloke point blank in his face. And as he says that line, he holds his hand up in the shape of a gun, and he holds it at Craig's temple, and then continues saying, his brains exploded out the back of his head and onto a piss-stained wall. Created quite the horror show Jackson Pollock painting. And then John moves his hand to the center console and pulls out the ashtray, and then John pulls out a cigarette and lights it, and then he asks, mind if we smoke? And John has this little evil, sinister look on his face as he puts the cigarette in his mouth, because he knows what he's doing. He's freaking Craig out. And as he lights up, he says, yes, Craig, old son, they nabbed me for murder. Funny that, for I've gotten away with much more nefarious crimes in my day. Why, there are corpses scattered from here to Timbuktu, have me bloody fingerprints all over them. And as he's saying this, he's just kind of puffing all the smoke in the car. And Craig, who's looking more and more worried that he's about to die because he picked up a murderer, asks sheepishly, could you? But John cuts him off asking, what? And he also gives him a very angry look when he says this. And a very scared Craig finishes his question in a whisper saying, crack the window? And John casually says, oh, right. Sorry. And as he says this, we do get a panel of the car driving down the highway, and there's a sign on the side of the road that says Interstate Highway 6. But someone has written out 2 more 6s on the sign, so it says 666. So it's just kind of fun in the artwork as Craig is stuck in a car with someone he thinks is a murderer. Then John casually leans back and puts his arm over the back of the seat, and he turns to Craig and asks, you ever been close to a corpse, Craig? And Craig starts to answer saying, But John cuts him off saying, you know, it's a misconception that once you die, you stop moving. Well, I can tell you from firsthand experience that this is simply not the case. First off, there's the death rattle, when the last bit of oxygen in your lungs flees the body. And then with a big grin on his face, he says, followed closely by what's left in the bowels, as the muscles let go of all propriety. Then John pulls out another cigarette and lights it and continues saying, now these very same muscles, they'll contract once they start to dry out, causing sudden herky-jerky movement and spasms. Then you get real animated as you swell up from gases being released as your innards rot, all fat and bloated like a banger. Well, your skin has only so much elasticity, right? You burst, then you ooze and puddle and collapse in on yourself. Quite a sight, Craig. Quite a sight. Though not as unnerving as the smell or the taste. And at that line, Craig gets really freaked out and he starts sweating a lot. And also I should mention that as John is talking about dead bodies and they're moving down the road, we're seeing the car pass by a lot of roadkill. So different animals of various sizes hit by cars at some point, and they're kind of rotting on the side of the road, which just adds to the atmosphere of what John is talking about with bodies. But luckily for Craig, he doesn't have to be in the car with John very much because he comes to a 4-way crossing and he slams on the brakes and he says to John, my turn. And John asks, come again? And Craig points to the right and says, I have to turn here. Dogleg that way. And then John puts his cigarette out and asks, is it? And then John turns to Craig and with a sinister look, he asks, Craig, And Craig, who looks like he's about to cry, he's got his eyes closed and his teeth clenched, and he thinks he's about to die, I'm pretty sure. And he asks, "What?" And then John just opens the door and gets out and says, "You really shouldn't pick up strangers." And then he walks away. So Craig did not die that night, luckily, and he probably got a crazy story out of it. So then we turn the page and we cut to John walking down the highway in the way that Craig pointed, I guess. And as John walks, he sees a mama possum who I can assume has been hit by a car because it's dead on the side of the road, but we do see its babies are on its chest kind of moving around, so they're not dead. And as John looks at it, he says, "Pity your pups will have just enough time on Earth to learn life's most important lesson." But he does not tell us that lesson. He just continues walking until eventually he sees two cars stopped on the side of the road. And as he approaches closer, he sees one man leaning on his car, and that car has his hood up, and the other car in front doesn't have anybody in it that we can see or on it. So John walks up to the man leaning on his car, and keep in mind, it is still like pitch black in the middle of the night. And John actually comes from behind the guy, and he says, "Hello, car trouble?" And the man turns to John and then stands up and says, "No." And then John looks at the motor and says, "I see. Just giving your motor a little breather?" And then the man, who's got like a stone face, just looks at John and says, "No, it's not my car." And along the road, there are some wooded areas, and out of the wooded areas, another man walks out and he says, "All right, John Roy, we can," but then he stops as he sees John, and he walks up to John Roy and he asks, "Who the fuck is he?" And John Roy answers, "Dunno." Then John points his thumb behind him at the car that's got its hood open, and he asks, "This your car then?" And the man from the woods says, "Huh? No. We just seen it here and stopped." And then John turns around and looks at it and says, "So it's abandoned then." And this is a cool panel because John Roy and his friend from the woods are on either side of John over his shoulders, and it looks like they're about to attack him, but then John has his eyes staring out at the reader, and he looks like he's got something up his sleeve. So he turns around quickly and points to the other car that didn't have its hood up, which is a Firebird, and he says, "I assume that's your car? Got room for one more?" And I guess they do, because as we turn to the next page, we see the Firebird driving down the road, and we hear John Roy ask John, "Want a beer?" And John answers, "I could do with one, yeah." And John Roy, who's driving, says, "In the cooler. Fetch us a couple too." And then John pulls out 2 beers and hands it to the men, and as he does, we see he's got kind of a evil grin on his face, and he says, "Cheers." And John Roy says, "Cool." And we see John Roy's friend in the passenger seat pop open the beer can, and he asks John, "Got a name?" And then we get this cool panel where John is all in silhouette except his teeth, and he says, "Me? I'm just a stranger." And I think that's a reference to something like a TV show or movie, because John immediately leans forward from the shadows and laughs and says, "Ha, sorry lads, always wanted to try that. Puts the shivers down your spine, eh?" And then both men, who didn't really laugh or do much of anything, just kind of stare, and then the passenger says, "Fuck, not really." Then John gets a big smile on his face and says, "Nah, never worked on me either." Then the passenger asks John, "So what the hell are you doing walking out in the woods anyway, stranger?" And John answers, "I'm on me way to Doglick." And John Roy asks, "Doglick? What the fuck you want to go to that shit pile for?" And John answers, "Well, you could say I'm out to meet some flies." And we see John kind of look around in the back seat, and he begins to feel around the back cushion for some reason. But then the passenger says, "I'll be fucked. This can must be broken." And John asks, "How so?" And the passenger answers, "It's empty. Snag me out another one." So I'm not sure if the passenger saw John doing that and then interrupted on purpose because he doesn't want John looking in the back seat. But John doesn't immediately reach for a beer, and the driver says, "Me too," because he wants John to get him a beer as well. Then John gets a big smile on his face, and the passenger turns around and he looks at John, and John says, "Say, you geezers interested in something a bit nastier?" And the passenger gets a big grin on his face and says, "What'd you have in mind?" And then John opens his coat, and he pulls out a bottle of Jack Daniels, and he says, "The only vice you Yanks got right." Then we cut to a little time later, and they're still driving, and the passenger asks John, "You're from England, ain't you?" Then John Roy, the driver, says, "Put on fog hat." And the passenger gets mad and says, "We just listened to it." Then John from the backseat asks, "Any Motorhead?" And John Roy likes that suggestion, so he says, "Yeah, put on Motorhead." But the passenger doesn't. He just says, "How about the Bodines?" And we can see he's looking at a cassette tape, and John Roy looks at him as he's drinking out of the bottle of Jack Daniels and driving, and he says, "Bodines? Why the fuck did you take that?" Then the passenger, who doesn't really know who they are, asks, "They suck?" Then John Roy takes another big swig of Jack Daniels, and he says, "Hell yeah, they suck ass." And then John chimes in, "Right you are, mate. Right you are. Their appeal lies with the ladies, and since we seem to be stag, fuck 'em." And then John Roy says, "Dad." And John asks, "What's that?" And that's kind of like a clever thing to do, where it seems like John Roy and his passenger maybe are up to some nefarious things. We saw them have a tape that they didn't really know what it was, and apparently they took from someone. And then as John was talking about not needing women and fuck 'em, John Roy said dead, so it's kind of alluding to a crime involving a dead woman with these guys. But then as we turn the page, we see John Roy say, "This bottle, we killed it." So it seems like he's kind of covering for his comment about dead women. So he chucks the bottle of Jack Daniels out the window, but then John says, "Well, it's a pity, but no need to mourn, boys. Fortunately, they travel in pairs." And then seemingly out of nowhere, John pulls a second bottle of Jack Daniels, and he hands it to the passenger, who gladly takes it, saying, "God damn, what the fucking kind of shit guy are you? Traveling around with nothing but 2 bottles of whiskey." And John replies, "That's an easy one. I'm the sort that don't mind foul clothes, or a fouler liver." Then the passenger opens up the glove box, and as he looks through, I guess for more tapes, he sees something and he says, "Hey, looky what I found." And then he pulls out a joint, and he looks back at John and says, "Who wants to get high?" And John looks at him with a big smile on his face, and he says, "High? Listen to me, Sonny Jim. I'm looking to be airborne." Then we see their car pass some more roadkill on the side of the road, and this time it's a raccoon, and John says, "I don't understand it." And John Roy asks, "What?" And John replies, "All the death at the side of your roads. It baffles me." And this must be sometime later because he had the Jack Daniels in his hand. So John leans forward and gives it to the passenger, and he continues saying, "I mean, you would figure some poor animal gets hit by a car. It's crushed under the wheels. You follow?" And then he leans back as the passenger takes a swig, and he continues saying, "But you rarely see them smashed and all blown over the asphalt. More often than not, their carcasses are off to the side, on the side of the road. It's like they were dumped there." Then the passenger hands John Roy the bottle, and John says, "Perhaps as a warning to the other animals, you think? Stay off the bloody road." And then John Roy says, "Yeah, never thought about it that way." And then he takes a swig of the bottle, and he says, "It's a fucking shame, you know?" And John asks, "What is?" And John Roy says, "I like you." And John, seemingly not picking up on the threat there, says, "I like you too, but let's not be acting like we was listening to no Bodines now, all right?" And then John Roy smiles and says, "See, that's what I like. Your attitude. What do you say, Hank? Maybe we should..." But Hank cuts him off saying, "Shut the fuck up." And John Roy protests asking, "What difference would it fucking make if he's not into it?" But Hank cuts him off again saying, "You know how this has to go down, John Roy." And John Roy squints like he doesn't like it, and he says, "I know, I'm just saying." And then from the back, because of course John heard all this, John says, "Hank's right, John Roy. You knew how this would play out the second you saw me." And then John leans forward and grabs the seat very hard, and he says, "But then, so did I." And both John Roy and Hank are looking back at John, and they're not paying attention to the street, which we can see from John's POV is about to turn. And I say John's POV, but we can see the rear view mirror looking back in the back seat, and no one's there anymore. And this is confirmed as we turn to the next page, and John Roy is looking in the back seat kind of bewildered, and Hank is now screaming because he looked forward and sees that they're about to miss the turn and fly off the road, which they do, and their Firebird flies through the air and then crashes head first into a tree, sending both men who were not wearing seatbelts out of the windshield. We get a couple panels of the dead bodies of both Hank and John Roy, and they're pretty gross. You can see lots of gore and blood and like brain matter and stuff. Then we see a hand reach up and take the keys out of the ignition, and we see John get out of the back seat and out of the car completely. So they kind of implied like maybe he vanished from magic, but I think what he did was he actually just rolled down into the floor of the back seat, and that way, I guess he would be protected from the crash. But he is spitting out blood and stuff as he's exiting, so he definitely got hurt a little bit at least. So John takes the keys and he walks around to the back of the car and he opens the trunk, and from the trunk's view, we see him say, "All right then, out with you." Then we turn the page and we see what's inside the trunk, and it is a woman who is in lingerie, and she is tied up and she has a gag in her mouth, and she looks kind of beaten and battered because she's bruised all over and her pantyhose are all torn. And as John pulls her out, he removes the gag and she says, "Don't hurt me." And as John holds on to her for balance, he says, There, miss. Wouldn't dream of it." And as John undoes her hands, she looks at him and he says, "Past a farmhouse about a half-kilometer back. I suggest you head there. Ring up the police." So the woman begins to walk that way, and John doesn't give her his coat or anything. She's just walking in lingerie, I guess back to this farmhouse. And as she walks, she says, "Where? Jimmy?" And John lights a cigarette, and then he says to the woman, "Apologies, love. Back by your car. That's where you'll find him. Just look off the side of the road." Which is kind of a reference to all the stuff John was saying about roadkill earlier. And then she walks the way she's going, and John walks the opposite way down the road until he's no longer able to be seen. And that, my friends, is the end of the issue. So if you guys have any comments, questions, or suggestions, you can email me at planestrains and comicbooks, all one word, @gmail.com. And we will see you on the next one.